If I could have one wish, just one wish today, this is a big one, but I think this is what I would wish for. So I've had a few days to think if I could say this in honesty, and I think I can. My one wish would be that Christmas would fall off the calendar and Easter would be the day we celebrate. Because Easter is the big day in Christianity. We get excited about Christmas because that's when Jesus was born, but here's the reality of that. Christmas was a tool to get us to Easter. Christmas is not what Christianity is about. Easter is what Christianity is about. So if we could put all of our energy and excitement into Easter rather than Christmas, I think we'd be really far, far ahead in terms of where the Bible places its emphasis. Oh, I know that there's a whole lot of excitement around the birth of Christ as you read the gospel narratives. I'm aware of that. I've read them as well. But the kingpin of Christianity was not the birth of Jesus. And the kingpin of Christianity was not the death of Jesus. The kingpin of Christianity is the resurrection of Jesus. Because everything hinges on that. Everything turns on whether that grave was really empty. But before we get to that part of Easter, here's one thing that I want you to really think about. Before you get to Easter, you've got to have the cross. And what I want you to know is something that you probably already know, but I want it to sink in and I want us to spend some time there. Jesus really died. And when he died, he left everybody who had their hopes in him in despair. They didn't know what to do next. Pretty much what Peter said was, okay, I guess I need to revive the old fishing business. You know, guys got to make a living doing something, so let's go fishing. Because with the death of Jesus, where we go from there is extremely questionable if there's no resurrection. So Jesus really died. None of Jesus' friends, none of his families, none of the apostles expected that he would be raised. I don't know what it is, and I didn't do the research to try to find out, but I don't know why 3 days ago Friday was called and is traditionally called Good Friday. Because you could ask any of Jesus' apostles, ask his mother, ask his siblings, ask anyone who was a believer in him, and they would have all told you there was nothing good about Friday. Because Friday symbolized defeat, despair, utter hopelessness, dreams dashed, and the future gone. So there was nothing good about Friday because Jesus really died. All the gospel accounts give special attention in their own unique ways to the death narrative of Jesus. Some of the gospel writers devote chapters to the last week of Jesus. For example, when you get halfway through the Gospel of Mark, you're already in the last week of Jesus' life. John spends 2 whole chapters telling us about the trial and the death of Jesus. Why so much time focused on the death of Jesus? Well, he really died. And that's what the gospel writers are wanting us to get from this. He really died. I think it's easy for us to allow Easter to so overshadow everything that we really fail to grapple with the fact that he died and hopes were dashed. Everybody in antiquity knew that when you died, you died. And that life was over at that point. So the gospel writers spend chapters talking about the death of Jesus to tell us that he really did die. The ancients spoke about resurrection, but they didn't believe it. Oh, the Jews believed that there would be a general resurrection at the end of time when everybody would be raised from the dead at the same time, the Jews specifically. But nobody believed that one person would be raised in advance of all the others. Sometimes we call resurrection, things in the Bible are called resurrection events, resurrections when they weren't. They were resuscitations. For example, Lazarus. Lazarus was resuscitated, but he wasn't resurrected. Because when you're resurrected, you live forever from that point forward. Lazarus was just brought to life to breathe a few more years and then die again. Jesus was the first person ever, and up to this point in time, the only person ever to be raised from the dead and have new life, never to die again. The ancient Greeks, nobody believed that you were going to be raised from the dead. When you die, you go to the netherworld. You know, you cross the river Styx, and here you are in Thanatos, and you're just there. Sometimes people go down in there in Greek mythology, and they're looking for certain ones, but they knew that they were there, and they weren't going to come out again. Of all of the Greek myths, resurrection was not heard of. So when Jesus died, everybody expected that was it. It's over. From this point forward, he really died. How can we know that he really died? Well, John, who we'll be looking at today, tells the story in some ways very similar to what the other gospel writers tell. But let's just look at something. How do we know that Jesus really died? Well, let's begin with John chapter 19, verse 38. Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for the body of Jesus. Now, Joseph was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly because he feared the Jewish leaders. With Pilate's permission, he came and took the body away. He was accompanied by Nicodemus, the man who earlier had visited Jesus at night. Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds. Taking Jesus' body, the two of them wrapped it with the spices in strips of linen. This was in accordance with Jewish burial customs. At the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid, because it was the Jewish day of preparation, and since the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there. John tells the story in much the same way when I was a junior in high school, took a journalism class, and I was taught, here's what you want to do in the first sentence of 2 of your article. You answer the questions, who, what, when, where, why, how. You answer all of those questions real quickly. And if you look at journal articles today, journalism particularly, you'll notice that that's kind of what we still do. So John answers basic questions to emphasize Jesus really died. For example, who took care of the funeral arrangements? Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. Well, who were they? Well, they were both well-recognized people, well-known. Members of the Jewish council. They were fairly wealthy individuals, kind of following Jesus at a distance, but very much interested in who he was and what he was all about. Well, what happened to his body? Well, those two men took the body and they prepared it for burial, and they buried him. They took care of funeral arrangements. Well, when was he buried? Immediately. You see, he was on the cross from about 9 a.m. to about 3 p.m., and they only had 3 hours to get him into the ground. So they did it immediately because the Jewish Passover was about to begin. The Sabbath was about to begin, and you've only got 3 hours to get him in the grave. So they buried him. They buried him with some specific details. For example, the 75 or so pounds of herbs and oils, spices that were used to prepare his body for burial. They buried him just like everybody else would have been buried in the Jewish world of that time. They used strips of linen. They packed those strips of linen with the spices, and then they wrapped the body of Jesus. Maybe they wrapped his fingers, each of his fingers, then they wrapped the whole hand, then they wrapped the arm, and then they wrapped the arm around the body so that he looked a little bit like a mummy. So They immediately did that because there was no time to waste, because being faithful Jews, they had to get him in the ground before 6 o'clock. So there's a mad rush. You and I are accustomed to taking some time when we bury someone. During COVID, sometimes burial has been postponed for weeks because we want to do what we can to honor the person who's passed away. But they didn't have time. 3 days, 3 hours. Oh, why did they do it so quickly? Well, not only was it just Saturday, the Sabbath that was just coming, but it was the Passover Sabbath. It's the big Sabbath of the year when thousands of Jews from all over the place would be coming into Jerusalem. They'd be preparing their meal for, the horseradish, if you've ever tasted that, something like that, and bitter herbs, the lamb that would be killed. They had to get everything ready. So they were preparing, and time was short. Well, how was Jesus buried? Well, according to Jewish custom. So what John wants us to know is that Jesus really was buried. The detail that's given indicates there were 2 steps to the Jewish funeral, which there were. The first step was to prepare the body. As they prepared the body, they would lay the body in a tomb, which they did. That tomb then would be sealed, which it was. And that body would be laying on a ledge with the intention that it would just be there for months, maybe a year or 2 or 3, until the body decomposed. And that was stage 1 of the funeral. Stage 2 would come a year or 2 or 3 later, when they would go back into that tomb. They would fold the body up, place the wrapping and the bones in a little box called an ossuary, and probably move it to the back of the cave where other ossuaries had been placed. So they really prepared stage 1 of the funeral, expecting that years later they'd come back for stage 2. This was not a pretend burial. Jesus really died. No life at all in his body, and no hope left for the believers. Okay, then where was he buried? In a garden tomb. We've got all of the details. The who, the what, when, where, why, the how. All of those questions answered. The burial of Jesus is so significant that Paul, later writing in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 4, said the burial of Jesus is part of the Christian confession. We believe he died. That needs to sink in, because death always comes before Easter. One of our families has experienced pain, death. Several of us have, actually. But one whose story we want to tell, because there's some overlap between death and new life. We know the story, but maybe you've not heard it in a one-time setting, as we're going to hear the Atufunwa family share their Easter type story now.
There's like a saying in my culture is the valley will teach you things that the mountaintop can never teach you.
December of 2019, I got pregnant and then lost that baby. We had a very rough few months.
February of last year was one of the lowest points in our marriage. Like having your wife who was pregnant like a few days before getting discharged from the hospital, but then she's not coming back with a baby.
A lot of asking God why, and struggled with a lot of not believing anymore. It was a very difficult time. And then we got pregnant again. So I went in for just the ultrasound, the first ultrasound. Chisholm wasn't with me because of COVID. And I got on the table and they asked if it was my first ultrasound, and I knew something wasn't right in that moment. But my head went to a really dark place, and I said, "Is something wrong?" And they said, "No, nothing's wrong." Then they told me that there was more than one, and then they told me that it was 3. So I immediately called Chisholm.
I think we had a family planning of like, just having a couple of kids, max 3 kids, where we can just fit everybody in a regular car. And I never thought I would be the dad that would drive the minivan.
So I went for my first appointment to a high-risk doctor here in town. But when you're pregnant with triplets, and 2 of them, Hannah and Abigail, were sharing a sac, so that made it even higher risk. The first appointment, they're going to be pretty heavy on the fetal reduction talk in order to increase your chances of carrying any baby to term, and to deliver and to have one baby. They would ask you if you wanted to just have one baby.
All 3 of them either survive, or all 3 of them end up not surviving. I think that was one of the hardest things to do.
And that was when I knew that we couldn't keep this a secret anymore, that we needed to pray, that this was higher risk than I thought. And I didn't think that I could lose another baby or babies that year. Like it just would have been too much for me.
Our life has been written, like God's life, like our story has been written already. And before these kids were conceived, God already has a plan for them. And it was one of those situations where we just said, we're willing to take whatever risk happens. And if it's God's will, it would happen. And I think we were glad that we left those to God, but it was something that was really, really difficult.
The past 3-4 months or so have been really, really difficult. It was hard to go in for an appointment that we thought would be completely routine, and then be told that things weren't right and that I was going to have to be there until the babies were born. And it was difficult to be so uncertain for the next 11 days about what was going to happen. We had difficult conversations with NICU staff and people who knew a lot about what to expect for babies born so early. All that was really, really hard. And then it was hard for them to be delivered and to see them so fragile, so vulnerable. The possibility of losing any one of them or all of them was very real. And there were lots of days that I stepped out of the NICU and into the lactation room and just sobbed.
We couldn't name them for 2 weeks because they would not put a name on the kids. They wouldn't give the kids a name just because the whole idea was like if the child doesn't survive in 2 weeks, that was it. Like they just had to be named baby A, B, and C for the first 2 weeks. And it was one of those situations where we had talked to the doctors and it wasn't necessarily, we were not really sure what would happen, and the initial thing we had to do was just going back and getting through the first 24 hours and the first 48 hours.
I also knew, and I think that this isn't something I would have thought too much about if it hadn't been for that miscarriage, that I was praying that the babies would live and that the babies would have happy, healthy lives. But I also knew that that's not the end of the story, that if they didn't, that was a very earthly desire that I wanted, but Jesus died so that wouldn't be the end of the story. And that was a difficult thing for me to come to terms with, but it was a good thing for me to come to terms with.
And also for Rachel being in the NICU, like she's the one that was there on a daily basis, like watching the kids grow, watching them breathe, watching the monitor and different devices go off because of some numbers went up or some numbers went down, and it's hard to see that. But looking back at it just gives you hope and believe that God always have a plan, even if we cannot really think about it. Like a year ago, we never thought we're gonna have 4 kids.
We prayed. We told the church prayed. That's what I'm most grateful for. Jason talked about how the church physically helped us and is still physically helping us with meals and gifts and things, but Gosh, those
The
prayers.
prayers,
Yeah, they carried us through.
Yeah.
Then they got to the NICU. Day 1 was great. Day 3 was great. Day 7 was great. All healthy brains, and then they all are home now, and they are great. They're just dealing with a few heart and lung issues that are very minor, and you cannot imagine how grateful we are for this. It doesn't make what we went through a year ago easier or better or okay. Like, I still struggle with that every day. I still think about our Gabe every day. I don't know. I just couldn't have expected a year ago that we could be this happy, but I think why should I be surprised? Like, this is how God works. He takes terrible things and turns them into beautiful things. But I just couldn't have imagined a year ago that I would have 3 babies to enjoy here.
Hello, Gilliland. What a fantastic day to be with you this morning. I will be reading the scripture today, and it is going to be from John chapter 18, verses 28 through 33, and I will be reading from the English Standard Version. Then they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early morning. They themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. So Pilate went outside to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered him, "If this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." The Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death." This was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken, to show by what kind of death he was going to die. So Pilate entered his headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?"
"'Twas the morning of Easter, written by Glynis Nealist, illustrated by Alina Sullivan-Nova, published by Zonderkids. 'Twas the morning of Easter, before the sun rose, 2 guards on a hillside were just trying to doze. You see, Jesus had died only 3 days before. A huge stone had been placed to seal the cave door. The disciples were sleeping, but tossed in their beds, as visions of danger swirled round in their heads. Would they be arrested and led away too? Without Jesus, their leader, what would they do? In her small, quiet home, not too far away, Jesus' friend Mary was planning the day. She would go to the cave with perfume and spice in hopes that her gifts would make Jesus smell nice. The sun, through the trees, was just starting to peep at the guards on the hill who were now fast asleep, when all of a sudden there came an earthquake, and the rocks and the trees all started to shake. The guards jumped in fright, then fell straight to the floor as the stone rolled away and unsealed the door. Then Mary arrived and crept up to the cave. She had to see Jesus. She had to be brave. But the cave was now empty. He just wasn't there. Mary sat down and wept, and her cries filled the air. But suddenly Mary heard someone behind. "Dear woman, who is it that you hope to find?" Mary jumped and turned round, so confused and afraid. Was this man the gardener? And why had he stayed? But the calm in his voice, the words that he said, soon let Mary know she had nothing to dread. "Dear Mary, it's me. It's Jesus, your friend. My story's just starting. This wasn't the end." His eyes, how they twinkled, his smile so bright. Mary knew in a moment. But could she be right? She gasped in surprise and cried, "Jesus, it's you! You came back to life. Your promise came true." Jesus nodded and said, "But there's no time to lose. You must tell the disciples. Go, spread the good news." So she jumped to her feet and away Mary went. She'd a story to tell, a tale heaven sent. She ran without stopping and called through the door, "Disciples, you've never heard this news before. Now Peter, now James, now Thomas, now John. I went to the cave. Jesus' body was gone, but he called me by name. He's alive. It is true. It's a miracle only our great God could do." Then the trees seemed to dance. Birds started to sing. All creation joined in to worship the King. "He's alive! He's alive!" the rocks cried in praise. The whole earth rejoiced on this day of all days. When later that night Mary knelt down to pray, she thought about all that had happened that day, and the stars heard her whisper through soft evening light, "Happy Easter to all, and to all a good night." Happy Easter, Reedland. When I first found this book, I did not know what it was about, and I didn't know how it was written. And it arrived, and I was excited because I loved the pictures. And then I was disappointed because the poetry reminded me of the poem "'Twas the Night Before Christmas." And I thought that was silly, and I thought that that didn't make any sense. But as I read the book, and as I began thinking about Christmas, I realized that it isn't such a bad thing to remember Christ's birth as we think on and reflect on Christ's death and burial and the resurrection that showed that he was alive again. It isn't such a bad thing to think about Christ's humanity, how he was so fully human that he was born just as we are born, and then lived a life that showed us so much about how we should live and be in this world, and then died in that fully human body. And then because of the life he had lived and because of the power of being God, he had the power to be alive again. There was an empty tomb that showed that this miraculous thing had happened. And so what started out as an irritation became something that I appreciated very much about this story and the way it was written. This remembrance of all of who Christ was and is to us. So this morning, as you reflect on that empty tomb, remember that it was empty because Christ lived a very human life, one full of heartache and joy, just like ours. And because the tomb was empty, we can be alive just as he is alive forever with God.
No one expected the resurrection. Nobody believed it would occur. You and I, some 2,000 years afterwards, kind of take for granted we're here today because of some connection with the resurrection. But had we been there, had we witnessed the death of Jesus on the cross, we would have been just like everyone else there, that when he died, we would have believed that was it. There was no more future. So those who visited Jesus' tomb first thing in the morning on Sunday morning, they did not go there with the anticipation of seeing a stone rolled away. I think that Mary, the first one who went, went with the same motives that some of us go to cemeteries today. We go there and we see the tombstone, and we see the names of the people there that we love and that we miss. And we go there to reflect and to cry and to wish. Sometimes we go with regrets, sometimes we go with smiles. But even now, when we go to a cemetery, we don't go there with the expectation that when we arrive, someone is going to come from the grave and speak to us. We believe that will happen, but not when we visit the cemetery. So Mary was distraught when she went to the tomb. Very discouraged, very frustrated, but certainly not expecting to hear Jesus call her name. Thomas had to touch Jesus' scars. When the word got back among the apostles, we've seen him, and Thomas' response, you'll remember, was, well, you may have seen him, but until I see him and until I touch those scars with my own fingers, I won't believe it. You may be duped by somebody. You may think he was raised, but I'm too intelligent for that. I'll have to see more proof and have more evidence than your testimony. The Apostle Paul didn't believe he'd been raised. That's why he spent his lifetime prior to becoming a Christian traveling wherever he could to find people who did believe in the resurrection. Because you turn a bunch of crazies loose in the world like that who believe that one man was raised from the dead ahead of all of the others. You turn a bunch of crazies loose in the world like that and they might deceive the whole world. So Paul went out to kill as many as he could. But the resurrection did depend upon the cross. Christmas came, and then Easter. That order is important to remember. I keep a cross in my office. This one is called the Trinity cross because it has Jesus hanging on the cross with God the Father in the background helping hold him there, and with the Spirit of God in the form of a dove up at the very top, so that all of God is involved in the death of Jesus on the cross. But Jesus' cross wasn't beautiful. It wasn't carefully polished and carefully cut out of stone or wood like crosses we have today. The cross of Jesus was rough-hewn. Nobody put you on a beautiful cross. It was rough. It was ugly. It was rugged. And yet Jesus is described as a man who saw that cross to be his glory. Because on the cross, he submitted to the will of God. And submitting to the will of God is where a person finds glory. The place that God glorified Jesus was on the cross. The cross is the story of our salvation, but it's also the story of Jesus' identity. The cross didn't just happen to Jesus. Jesus sought the cross. And he embraced the cross because he knew that life could not come prior to death. We've been surrounded by death for the past year. It's really been difficult for us. COVID has been cruel. It has had a somewhat similar function to a rough-hewn cross. It's taken life from us. It's caused us to feel alone. It's caused us to hide and to stop engaging. It's caused us to stay away from groups like church. It's caused us to not go into the office like usual. It's caused us to wear protective gear. And in a sense, we have carried a cross the past year. The loneliness, the anxiety, the guilt that we felt as people we love, as our own family members, have been locked into a hospital, into a room where they laid and died alone. It hasn't been easy. So Easter comes at a good time. Easter comes at a good time, the spring of the year for us, when we can begin to expect to live our lives again. When we can begin to expect to take these silly masks off our face, though I've got to admit I've not had a cold for 12 months. No pollens that have caused me to get cough and sputter all over everybody. But I'm ready to get rid of mine. Just like Joseph and Nicodemus prepared Jesus' body in a hurry because it was the day of preparation and they just had a couple hours left to get him ready. So you and I can be seen to be in a period of preparation ourselves. That we wear our masks, that we're getting our vaccines. I don't know about you, but all of my family is getting their vaccines. All of us don't have it as yet, but we all intend to get it as we can. Is it going to shorten my life? Good. What do I have to lose? Right? And that's more than just true. It's really an absolute truth. I don't buy into conspiracy theories. That's just me. I don't think somebody's back there trying to put stuff in chemicals to kill me sooner. That's just not where I am. But what I am doing and what my family is doing is we are preparing for new life. We're preparing to re-engage. And I'd like to suggest that today could be the beginning of a new season for all of us. A little more patient, a little more time, but the beginning of a new season for us. Easter comes at a needed time this year. Too close to death. One of my fears is that some of us as believers will have become so frightened or so lackadaisical perhaps that we will forget that there is a community of God's people to re-engage with. That there is a need for us to come back and live the Easter life. Not just kind of believe it remotely, but to actually engage with it and to live it. This morning, I put my hand on Kelly Walden's shoulder and prayed with her a moment, and you'll know why momentarily. And I felt guilty about doing that. Should I touch her? Should I not? Cheryl Goodman, she's buried her mom thanks to COVID. And it's been a difficult time. And I asked Cheryl if it was okay to hug her. I look forward to the day, Cheryl, I don't have to ask you if it's okay. I might have to ask Tony, but I don't have to ask you if it's okay. Shoot, Tony, I might even hug you too. I mean, there is a need for us to re-engage life. And that's what Easter is about. It's not about death. It's not yesterday's news. It's tomorrow's eternity. And I'd like to suggest Easter for us can be just that. A day of hope. A day of dreams. We've got to decide what's going to have the last word in my life. Christmas, well, as good as that is, that's not the last word. It's a tool to get to the last word. COVID, is that the last word? Not at all. It's an inconvenience and a frustration. The last word is Easter. The last word is an empty tomb. Jesus' burial preceded his resurrected life. He really died, but folks, he really lived too. And he lives. He lives and he is here just as assuredly among us this very moment as any of us are here and alive right now. One of the things that is mentioned about the Easter faith in Scripture is that when you and I were baptized into Christ, or if you haven't been, consider this an invitation to do so. We go down into the water, and when we go down into the water, the Scripture equates that metaphorically to Jesus going down into the tomb. And when we come out of the water, it's Jesus coming out of the tomb. He literally died so we don't have to. And our own baptisms become a reenactment of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. I've heard in a recorded dress rehearsal what you're about to hear. And when I heard it on the video, I was so moved by it, so moved that it put tears in my eyes. And I hope that it will do the same for you as now we share in a special dramatic reading that Kelly Walden has written and will perform for us now.
Those great gut-wrenching sobs coming from Mary Magdalene wrenched our hearts as we sobbed with her. We all shared the same grief, but Mary had more to lose. We'd all lost our heart and soul, our love, our light, our leader, and our hope. It had just drained out of us as we watched the life drain out of Jesus. But Mary had been delivered from 7 demons. Jesus had cast them out. Or had he? Had it all been a sham? Maybe it was all in her head. And now those demons were laughing at her, taunting her for her belief in some God who could cast them out. Or maybe it had been real, and Mary had been free. But now Jesus was dead, and he had no power over them anymore. Mary's heart tore open with the desperate, gnawing fear that they were returning. Were they whirling and quivering at the edge of her brain right now? Laughing deliriously that they could occupy her again, shackle her soul, and control their favorite pawn? She would rather die. We knew she would. Her freedom had been so precious. How could she go back to their oppression, to that terrible torture? It was an unbearable thought, gripping her throat and squeezing her stomach so tight she could hardly breathe. She was sobbing so hard, doubled over and gasping, that at first she didn't even see him. And then he said, "Mary." He said, "Mary." He said her name.
Don't you just love spring? I mean, everything is budding and blooming and coming back to life, and it's getting warmer out, and I can't tell you how many times I've looked at a tree or a plant or a flower that we had planted the year before and thought, well, there's no way that made it through the winter. It was just too harsh and too cold, only to be surprised to see it budding days later. It's like a divine choreography, the seasons. You know, the same soil that was hard and cold and dead, covered in snow, is now warm and alive and bringing forth new growth. You know, 51 weeks out of the year, when we come together and we take this meal, we talk about the death of Christ. I'd say that's fitting because we're told in 1 Corinthians 11 that when we eat this meal, we proclaim the death of Christ until he comes again. And it goes on to say that the night that Jesus was betrayed, he took the bread, he took the cup. He said, "This is my body, this is my blood." Surely he went to the cross, he died, his body, his blood were given that we would remember his death. But that's the winter. It's the winter of the soul. 1 week out of the year, we get to come and remember and be reminded that death is not the end of the story. Easter reminds us that the winter is getting ready for the spring. Jesus said in John chapter 6 that I am the bread of life. He says that whoever eats the bread of life won't be hungry again. Whoever drinks this cup won't thirst again. You see, how can something that has died bring new life? How can that which has gone to the grave continually quench our thirst? The grave was the long, hard, dark, cold winter. But on Easter Sunday, spring came. On Easter Sunday, we are reminded that the body rose again, was reanimated, was given new life, that there was resurrection power, and the same power that raised Jesus from the grave is the power working in you and I. So on Easter Sunday, as we approach this table, today we see the bread, we see the cup, and we're reminded of life. You know, when you look at the cold, hard ground of winter, when you look at the dark, short days, you have to remember that spring is coming. And when you look at the grave, when you look at the cross, when you look at the sacrifice of Jesus, when you look at his death, you have to remember that resurrection is coming. And when you look at your life, and you look at your struggle, and you look at your sin, and you look at your pain, you need to remember that today, on Easter morning, in the body and the blood of Christ, you are promised new life. You are promised forgiveness of sins, and you are promised a God who's going to wipe every tear away. So eat and be filled and drink and never thirst again.
I can see the waters raging at my feet. I can feel the breath of those surrounding me. I can hear the sound of nations rising up. We will not be overtaken. We will not be overcome. I can walk down this dark and painful road. I can face every fear of the unknown. I can hear all God's children singing out. We will not be overtaken. We will not be overcome. The same power of Jesus from the grave, same power lives in us, lives in us. The same are true in his strength. There is nothing we can do, yes we know. There are greater things in store. We will not be overtaken. We will not be overcome. The same power of Jesus from the grave, same power lives in us, lives in us.
morning, church family, and happy Easter. I was contacted by Brian after I had texted a little message to Terrell about my creativity and art. And Brian had asked me if I would do something for the church for Easter. And I was just thrilled. I am so thankful and blessed by God with my gift of art and creativity. I have made this banner, and I'm still working on it, for the church family from Kevin and myself for Easter Sunday. And the colors, the design, the inspiration came from God. And the lettering, the colors all came from the Lord. Of course, Kevin has a really good eye, and he has helped me a lot with the different shades and so forth and composition. But it is just with great happiness and pleasure and joy, great joy, to present this canvas to the church on Easter. This was the inspiration. I had done this little drawing for a Christmas present, and I decided I liked it. So I kept it. And it's a good thing I did, because this composition and the colors was my idea behind the banner. So Brian and I have talked about the symbolism in this composition as far as the layers of the earth. The three trees, Brian came up with the great symbolism of being the three crosses. And then he is risen in purple for the glory and honor and royalty of Jesus. Again, Kevin and I wish you a very blessed and happy Easter, and we really hope that this banner will bring joy and happiness to you today. Thank you.
The resurrection is what the Christian life is all about. But just as the Atufunwa was, sometimes it leads us to the very brink of death. Satan leads us into a path that we are threatened in. And without our hope of the resurrection, that Jesus will deliver us even in the threat of death, even in the threat of ruin, whatever it might be, because we are committed to Him, we believe in that resurrection power that is in each of us. And I think that's important for us to understand and to listen to what Paul said in Ephesians chapter 1, where he prays for His incomparable great power for us who believe. That power is the same as the mighty strength He exerted when He raised Christ from the dead and seated Him at His right hand in the heavenly realms, far above all rule and authority and power and dominion and every name that is invoked, not only in the present age, but also in the one to come. The same power that raised Jesus from the dead when He was dead and buried for 3 days. It wasn't like, well, they thought He was dead. No, He was dead. There was a soldier that pierced His side, and out of it came blood and water, which indicated it hit into the actual heart and the pericardium around the heart, so that the water and the blood came out together. There was no doubt He was dead. Dead for 3 days. The same power that raised Him from the dead, God is able to raise us up as well. So may that confidence in His power that raised Jesus from the dead work in you this week. So regardless of what threat Satan may throw before you, your confidence in the power of God will be even greater, that you're able to be faithful even during those times. Go with God, and may God bless you this week and to be a blessing in your community. Amen.
I sought the Lord, and He answered me and delivered me from every fear. Those who look on Him are radiant. They'll never be ashamed. They'll never be ashamed. This poor man cried, and the Lord heard me and saved me from my enemies. The Son of God surrounds his saints. He will deliver them. He will deliver them.